Today is From Looking Through an Anti-Racist Lens by Enid Lee. When examining cases of racism and inequality, we often explain them in terms of lack of individual effort, bad luck, human nature, or inevitability of inequality. These explanations are not grounded in a social understanding of events and processes. In contrast, viewing the same cases through an anti-racist lens allows us to see how the use of power by individuals, communities, and institutions has brought about the current situation, and see how power is used to make change or to keep things the way they are, particularly with regard to the issues of rights, respect, resources, and representation based on skin color. An anti-racist lens leads us to look at the historical roots for both explanations and for solutions. The most important feature of an anti-racist lens is that it leads us to see how situations can be transformed and how injustices can be reversed. It draws our attention to the ways in which power can be used and is used at the individual, community, and institutional levels for change. Using this approach, we have identified ways in our own UU history where we have contributed to and fought against racist policies. We acknowledge our mistakes and change the way we do things to be more inclusive, with people of color as our guides to create beloved community. The widening the circle of concern is such a product of this kind of study at the UUA level. Our church will be offering the programming for the entire next year to examine our own community and make changes to become a more beloved community. But the term beloved community was made popular by Martin Luther King Jr. It was his vision of justice, not for one oppressed group, but for all people. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He envisioned a society in which there was equity and all people would see each other as equals. A society based on justice with equal opportunity and love for our fellow human beings. This feels like liberation to me. For me, beloved community relates directly to our own seventh and eighth principle. The seventh principle speaks of of respect and reverence for the interdependent web of all existence. You know, at the beginning, I thought of that in terms of environmental issues often. But for me now, I see it as the beloved community is the human side of that principle. What affects one affects all. No one of us is free until all of us are free. Our eighth principle calls us to journey towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. I live this out by working with our beloved community committee here at First UU and helping with the programs that our congregation will be offering this year in widening the circle of concern. I hope you will all join us.
You know, Jeannie, when many people think of liberation theology, they think of social justice out in the broader world, and that's obviously a huge piece of it. But it begins inside our congregation with what we do within these walls.
Right, Gail, just like in the story you told with the wagon wheels. We need to work from our mission and vision and covenant and principles before we can do justice.
And that's one of the first steps, making all those things align in a way that takes us to the vision we hold. Then there's more. I know a lot of our congregation has been active in things like workers' dignity as they work towards economic justice. And we have to be as aware of economic justice inside our walls as outside. And that's why our latest budget shows some major adjustments in salaries for some of our folks. It took us a while to get there, but our budget, as Bob Day has said over and over again, is a moral document, and economic justice is a moral document. Is a moral issue. Supporting our staff and respecting the boundaries that they must maintain are also ways that we walk the walk here at First UU. But that's not the only internal issue we need to keep in mind. I'm thinking about the issue of accessibility so that everyone can participate in whatever we do.
Absolutely. We need to be more accessible in our communities, within the church, in our church building. We need to make it as accessible as we can, and in our work in the world. Most people think of accessibility with regards to vision, hearing, mobility.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and those are important things. So, but there are others as well, like what time do we set our meetings? How do we accommodate families with small children? Or folks who have limited transportation or who may not have access to the internet?
Yeah, and accessibility also includes making space for neurodiversity and marginalized voices. And above all, listening to feedback on how we're doing and acting on that feedback. We must consider how we treat staff, congregants, and our community, and when working towards justice. We've got to be right to do right.
Amen.
Accessibility is quickly becoming a really big issue for me. Every time I hurt myself, I'm reminded of it. But also, for many of us, having a quick break of something other than talking is just as important as ramps and elevators and visual descriptions. So, I'm doing something really out of the box for me. I brought my friend, my ukulele. I'm not very good, but we're gonna have a little snippet of step by step. And by the way, if for you this has been a lot of talking, I understand. And know that it is not going to bother me if you need to fidget or doodle or go stand in the back, try and stay out of the camera position for our friends on Zoom, and move your body a little bit, because I understand, because that's where I am on a lot of Sundays. Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can build an arch, singly none, singly none. Thank you. I couldn't have been more vulnerable just then if I had stripped naked and danced for you. Everyone's favorite liberal theologian, or maybe just my favorite liberal theologian, John Luther Adams, gave a critique of liberalism as an intellectual movement, and there were 4 points he saw as the failings of liberalism. The first is that liberalism has a dynamic sense of truth and an insistence that nothing is exempt from criticism. And this is often watered down or misinterpreted into the notion that all things or beliefs must be treated as equally true. He criticized liberalism's devotion to consent and the rejection of all forms of coercion, and says this creates a culture of hyper-individualism. Third point, liberalism is infected with the middle-class belief that democratic community is already achieved, and this undermines prophetic criticism from other perspectives who feel less liberated. Liberalism also distorts into a faith in progressive enlightenment through education. If we could all just learn enough, or know enough, or have enough subject area mastery, everything would be great, And everyone who is making things not great, that's not us, we're the good people. Everything that's not great could be fixed if we could just teach those people who don't know what we know. And here's the thing about this. James Luther Adams, who I have abbreviated in my notes here as JLA because we're friends now, he wrote this critique of liberalism over 50 years ago. And these points still seem very valid today. And we as Unitarian Universalists, we are rightly proud of our spiritual ancestors. And we are getting increasing, you're going to notice I'm going to try and use the word and instead of but a lot. Because but says this is not true, and now this second half of the sentence is true, and says these contradictory things are true, are both true all at once. So go on this ride with me, okay, guys? And we are getting increasingly good about recognizing that their ideas were flawed. Our transcendentalist ancestors were for the abolition of slavery, while also failing to recognize the full humanity of the people they wanted to free from enslavement. Our suffragette ancestors wanted the vote for white women. And while we as a denomination have been deeply involved in standing up for LGBTQ rights and inclusion, often that movement has centered the voices of white cis men at the expense of our siblings of color and trans and non-binary folk. And as best I can tell, our ancestors were being very good liberals. They had specific solutions to specific problems. The abolitionists understood slavery was a problem, and they saw the emancipation of enslaved people through whatever means necessary as a solution. The women's suffrage movement saw gaining of the vote for women as success. And these were steps along the march, right? Many white people saw, or even still see, the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as the culmination of the work of the civil rights movement and the end of racism forever. And the affirmation of marriage equality in Obergefell v. Hodges was the culmination of LGBTQ equality. Done and dusted, right? No. And the problem with a lot of these solutions is this. They take the position that oppression is a problem to be solved, and helping solve it is the least we can do as good people. And we know we're good people because our theology tells us so. And there's a saying that floats around a lot that's attributed to Australian Aboriginal activists. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And in this is the very core of liberation theology. Every movement that has called itself a theology of liberation, from South American Catholics to Black liberation theologians, to our own moving to embody a Unitarian Universalist liberation theology, has called for the centering of the voices of those directly affected by oppressions. To tell their stories, respond as invited to their needs and requests, and to build together a new way of being together, and to fundamentally understand that none of us are free, while some of us are oppressed. It is to constantly grow and move together in an inclusive, responsive way to build a place that meets everyone's needs. It is a theology of direct experience in which people's needs are prioritized. Liberalism, by contrast, is a theology of the mind. We can think our way to our best selves and our best communities. Liberation, by contrast, is a theology of embodiment. Working together, we can live most fully in peace, justice, and joy. One of my favorite authors, Stephanie Pearl McPhee, who is also known as the Yarn Harlot, once wrote that often the solution to a problem requires a novel or creative approach. The analogy she used was that if we try and solve every problem with the same solutions and the same problem-solving rubric, it's like parenting, by feeding your kids a peanut butter jelly sandwich and reading the same bedtime story every night. And then, if that stops working, if the kids start misbehaving, rather than trying to figure out what's happening behind the misbehavior, rather than paying attention to behavior as communication, you try and fix whatever problematic behavior has come up by feeding those same children 2 peanut butter sandwiches and reading them that same bedtime story twice but louder. And liberal theology, and liberalism more largely, being so about thought and identifying problems and crafting solution to those problems, often gets mad when our old solutions don't solve the problems they were aimed at, right? Why on earth is there still racism? We ended slavery. We did that. That was over 100 years ago. Yay us. We passed the Civil Rights Act. We did it. It should be over, right? But here we are. People of color are still complaining about racism again. This is, we good white people really struggle with this. And the problem, we just need to educate more people to solve this problem. We need to tell them why they shouldn't be racist, right? Right? It feels good because we've got a plan, and we're just going to keep working on that plan. And our friends who are in project management call this way of solving problems a waterfall process. You lay out the problem, you lay out the steps to solve the problem. Implement those steps, test the results, and then maintain the system. And this works perfectly if you are designing a word processor or an office building. But for pretty much everything else, the parts of the system are completely changing and shifting. And that is not comfortable, and discomfort makes a lousy slogan. Liberation theology is more like what project managers call an agile process. Agile processes are iterative. You have a vision, you figure out what you need to do toward that plan right now, or within a short period of time. You and your team figure out how to do these things, then you do those things, and you reconvene to figure out what worked, if anything needs to be fixed, how to fix those broken things, and then you keep doing that. Rinse and repeat. Ad infinitum, right? You just keep doing it over and over again. And the thing you're building keeps getting better and better. This is how you build a website that continues to function for years and years and years, for example. And teams working with agile methods do what they can, and when they need to do something else to solve a new problem, they do that. A process like this creates a thing that grows and changes and lives. For example, from my life, there was a point when my oldest child was about 10 months old when it became abundantly clear that our 2 naps per day plan was not working. And rearranging our daily sprint to not repeat nap helped the whole project of raising a human from this big to she's now this big, helped that whole project progress. And so instead of being mad that the previous thing that had worked no longer did, although I was mad for a hot minute there, we changed in response to a change in the circumstances. That is, the changed circumstances were the kiddo's brain development, right? So in a more justice-oriented context, there was a point in 2017 where it seemed super obvious that the way for people of faith to stand up for the immigrants in our community was to offer sanctuary on our campus, to house people who were under threat of ICE action in our church buildings. And this was a method that had been effective in protecting immigrants in the 1980s and in the early to mid-2000s. And so when there was a fear of increased immigration enforcement under the Trump administration, this was the solution that we all reached for. But folks who were under the greatest threat of immigration enforcement action and deportation didn't want that. They wanted our solidarity. They wanted us to speak up. They wanted us to use our resources to support them. They did want temporary respite on our campuses when the threats were most acute, but it was a much smaller thing than we had initially envisioned. We had envisioned a heroic rushing in and letting people live in our churches, right? And as it developed, the choice was really simple: to be mad that the type of help we were trying to offer wasn't what was wanted, or to recognize that people directly affected, directly impacted, knew better than we did what they needed. It wasn't as glamorous, but it was far more effective. So in other words, liberation theology doesn't see people and their suffering as problems to be solved. It instead sees people as bound together in an interconnected web. Familiar sounding language? where we can work together to build something that works for all of us. And feelings are scary and hard to navigate, much harder to navigate than thinking through good solutions to problems. Feeling things alongside others means letting go of my own comfort, of my own privilege, and being changed through the hearing of stories. Transformation almost never feels good while it's happening. While it's happening, it feels scary and weird and uncomfortable, and it can be very tempting to lash out in anger. It just is. And I want to tell you guys a secret about how Gail's story ends. The far-off beautiful land is a mirage, or probably is. But in building the wagon, in coming together to get there, it turns it into a place we're building together. It's like one of those old European cities. I think of it this way, just because I've watched a lot of shows about archaeology. Liberation is like one of those old European cities where people have been living basically as long as there have been humans, where you've got skyscrapers next to cobblestones, and if you dig under the cobblestones, you find evidence of an Iron Age civilization. Because the deeper you dig, the more history you unearth, the newer solutions toward humans living together in one spot people came up with. Because this is the land that is right here, right now, and that's where liberation is happening. It's happening here. It's happening radiating out into the city and radiating in onto us. Nothing is ever truly permanent but change. So liberation is about understanding that we are all bound together and being transformed through relationship and story. It's about building new ways, step by step, right here, right now. And we need to tell stories together to remember the world as it was and to imagine worlds that could be and to hear and understand who we could be together. In The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, it's a book set in a world that's like a future world. It's a few years ahead of where we are now, and climate change is worse. All of the things that are bad now are just a little bit worse. And the protagonist is a teen girl who creates her own religion in which God is change. And she writes a set of verses to go with her religion. And so I'm going to conclude today with a verse from Parable of the Sower. Your teachers are all around you. All that you perceive, all that you experience, all that is given to you or taken from you, all that you love or hate, need or fear, will teach you if you will learn. God is your first and your last teacher. God is your harshest teacher, subtle, demanding, learn or die. Thank you.
Please rise in body or in spirit and join in singing number 121 in our gray hymnal, We'll Build a Land. Just to make sure you all know, we've changed the words in the chorus from sisters and brothers to people together. That'll be displayed on the screen behind me. It's written in my hymnal, but it may not be written in yours. And just a heads up.
We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the and will give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come, build a land where people together, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land, building up ancient cities, raising up devastations from old, restoring ruins of generations. Oh, we'll build a land of people so bold. Come, build a land where people together, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. Come, build a land where the mantles of praises resound from spirits once faint and once weak, where like oaks of righteousness stand her people. Oh, come, build a land, my people we seek. Come, build a land where people together, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
Please remain standing for our chalice extinguishing.
Join me in saying these words by Elizabeth Sell Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.
Today's benediction is from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents, which is the sequel to Parable of the Sower. Kindness eases change, love quiets fear, and a sweet and powerful positive obsession blunts pain, diverts rage, and engages each of us in the greatest, the most intense of our chosen struggle. Go in peace.